Welcome to this training video, which supports the delivery of the Year 11 Relationship Realities Unit as part of the OAT Citizenship and PSHE Education curriculum. This unit consists of a total of 4 lessons, which build upon the RSE units taught in earlier year levels. These lessons also feature mature content, which is more appropriate for Year 11 pupils than for younger years. The first lesson focuses on the potential effects of pornography, the second lesson on appropriate ways of ending relationships, the third is about stalking, and the final lesson explores where young people can access sexual health services. This unit is deliberately shorter to allow time for specific content to be covered in the final weeks before Year 11 exams, based on the needs of your pupil cohort. Alternatively, this extra time may help in catching up on content from earlier in the year, which was missed or which requires further attention. The first lesson starts with the baseline Do Now activity, which encourages pupils to consider the content covered in previous RSE units. Ideally, you would give pupils 2 or 3 minutes to list a word starting with each letter of the alphabet, which somehow relates to this picture. They may, for example, come up with words such as condom, pill, sex, or health. One way of encouraging all pupils to contribute at the beginning of this lesson is to ask them to each provide an answer for an assigned letter as you take the register. For example, the first pupil would respond with a word starting with the letter A, the next with B, and so on. If a pupil doesn't have an answer for their assigned letter, you could open it up to discussion from the wider class, and where possible, try to circle back to those pupils who weren't able to provide an answer to try to involve them as much as you can. Pupils then have an opportunity to discuss where they think young people are likely to access information about sex, and which of those resources pupils think are the most reliable. It's important that comments during this discussion and across the lesson as a whole are distanced and talk about other people or are anonymised rather than talking about people's own experiences. This graph is one of 2 included in the slide deck, which uses data from a research paper by Zero Tolerance. In this study, young people were asked to identify the sources from which they learnt about sex, and they were able to select multiple options for this question here. You can see the most common sources of information were peers from the same gender, school lessons, and young people's romantic partners. The second graph on the later slide shows which of these sources young people identified as their primary information source. Peers of the same gender remained first, followed by television and film, pornography, and then school lessons in fourth. When discussing these results, encourage pupils to share their reactions, so their data points which are surprising or which they might not agree with. And then you can link back to content from the Year 9 Media Literacy unit by asking pupils to reflect upon which of those sources they think are most likely to be reliable and factual. You could also draw comparisons between the 2 graphs, highlighting, for example, that 40% of young people in this slide said that they learnt about sex to some extent from pornography, but 15% of them then reported that it was their main source of information. After working collaboratively to define the term pornography, pupils are asked to consider whether specific descriptions of media content would be deemed as pornographic. For clarity, these are only brief written descriptions of what content might be, rather than any actual images or content itself. This activity is based on a resource from Brooke and the British Board of Film Classification, and a teacher guide from them is provided to support classroom discussion after pupils have completed the initial part of the activity. One of the examples of media content included in this activity is a nude image sent via text. This example isn't actually one that's from the original Brooke and BBFC resource or the teacher guide, but it's been included in order to open up conversations about pupils' perceptions. It also links back to content about nudes from Year 9. Given that the legal definition of pornography, shown on slide 10, refers to the intent to arouse, it's likely that a naked image is being sent from one partner to another with the purpose of arousal, and therefore it would meet the definition of pornography. Data from a 2023 report by the Children's Commissioner is then used to explore where young people report having seen online pornography. It's important to clarify some basic data literacy with pupils regarding this graph. It's not saying that 41% of young people who have been on Twitter have seen pornographic content. It's also not saying that young people see pornographic content on Twitter 41% of the time. This figure reflects that 41% of the young people surveyed have ever seen pornographic content on Twitter. The graph also doesn't reflect the frequency or the intent associated with seeing that sort of content. It's very possible that people may have unintentionally come across pornography while scrolling through social media, although it's probably safe to assume that the 37% of young people who reported seeing these pictures or videos on pornographic websites actively sought out such content. There are two further graphs to discuss, which focus on the ages at which young people report having seen pornographic content and the extent to which they intended to do so. Both graphs show that younger people tended to unintentionally stumble across pornography, and that those who are intentionally seeking out pornography make up only a small proportion of all young people. It's also important to recognise that young people are often passive recipients of pornography, with unsolicited images or videos being sent to them. Information about pornography laws in England is then discussed before pupils consider the potential effects of pornography on young people. The lists on slides 19 and 20 outline examples of possible benefits and common criticisms of pornography, and have been worded in such a way that you can explain their meaning to a degree of detail which is linked to pupils' level of understanding. For example, one of the cited potential benefits is that pornography may be seen as a safer alternative to risky sexual behaviours. On one level, you could simply explain that watching pornography won't lead to pregnancy or an STI, as often becomes the focus when discussing risks about sex. However, you may be able to have a more detailed conversation with pupils about the flip side of this same point. Although viewing pornography itself may prevent these physical risks, it might actually instead encourage specific behaviours, such as not using condoms or mistreating partners when the same person starts to engage in sexual acts with others. It's also important to clarify that these lists are only examples, and that additional benefits and criticisms could also be identified. Following on from this discussion, pupils are asked to look at this diagram on their worksheet, which outlines the findings of a range of studies into people who watch pornography. Pupils should add a comment about what the cause of each effect might be, and what the knock-on consequences of each effect may also be. So, for example, the focus of pornography tends to be on casual relationships rather than long-term relationships, which then may have an impact on a viewer's attitude towards casual sex and their behaviour afterwards. So they may focus on their own pleasure rather than trying to develop a long-term emotional connection with a partner. The final activity of this lesson is based on a resource from Medway Public Health, which is available to those with PSHE Association memberships. As a class, you would read through the handout which details Diego's relationship with pornography between the ages of 12 and 16, before giving pupils time to reflect on these questions. The Medway Public Health lesson plan provides additional information which could be useful during conversations with pupils. It's important that this discussion doesn't demonise Diego for viewing pornography, but equally you need to steer clear from advocating his behaviours. The question in the third bullet point, for example, is an open question asking pupils to decide whether or not Diego's behaviour becomes problematic, rather than telling pupils that it becomes problematic. Pupils might identify the change in the type of content he's watching or his upskirting as examples of starting to go too far. If pupils think that these behaviours are normal or acceptable, pivot the conversation to explain related laws. To support with the delivery of this lesson, there's also a folder provided with other resources, including a range of research papers and other useful reports. Lesson 2 begins with pupils being asked to list the traits or characteristics that they think have been identified as being the most sought after in a romantic partner. Pupils can then be pushed to think further about which attributes would be most attractive in a short-term relationship and which would be better in a longer-term relationship. After pupils have created their lists and discussed suggestions as a class, you can then compare them to the findings of research by Apostolou and Christoforou and allow pupils to share their reactions on those. This lesson focuses on mature ways to end a relationship and identifying behaviours which are less healthy. After identifying examples of the reasons why relationships might end, pupils are given 6 scenarios to read and are asked who, if anyone, is being unreasonable in each scenario. The concept of this task is based on agony aunt style posts, which often feature on platforms such as Reddit, where a person posts about their situation and asks others to offer commentary or advice. If pupils identify a character as acting unreasonably, then they should explain why the certain behaviours are problematic. You could also make links to prior RSE content by asking which of these scenarios is most reflective of a healthy relationship and which is the least healthy relationship. The last main task in this lesson involves pupils considering how people might act in response to a breakup. Pupils have a handout with 20 different suggestions, and they should plot as many of these actions on the axes on this worksheet. Plots towards the left are ones considered to be less helpful or useful actions. Those to the right are more helpful or more useful. The higher up on this graph, the better it's going to make the person feel in carrying out those actions. The lower down, the worse they think it will make them feel. Ideally, pupils are also going to annotate some of their responses to show their thinking. This diagram is then also included within the slide deck, so you can use that to compare pupils' perceptions and where they have plotted different examples. As an example, response A relates to the act of attempting to sabotage their ex's new relationship. I'm going to place it here in the top left quadrant. Although it might be quite satisfying to ruin the new relationship, particularly if the ex was responsible for that breakup, it's fair to say it's probably not going to be healthy or helpful to continue to focus on what the ex is doing. Instead, this person should try to focus on themselves and move on. Ideally, pupils should have their own copies of both this worksheet and the handout, because the handout will also be used in the next lesson when considering behaviour which could be considered to be stalking. The examples are quite wordy, so pupils could use the associated letter on their plots, as I've done in this first example, or they could use keywords, as in this second example. This task, naturally, has a degree of subjectiveness to it. It's unlikely that every pupil is going to place every example in the same location, and that's why it's important to include time to discuss pupils' responses as a class and to tease out those justifications. For example, although it might be good to take up a new hobby, in my second example, they might be starting to go to the gym again, this behaviour could actually become a crutch and potentially become problematic if it's being used to completely ignore the reality of what's going on in this person's life. You need to encourage pupils to consider alternative viewpoints and to show that the actions are not always clearly good or clearly bad. You could also ask pupils to annotate their worksheet using a pen of a different colour to reflect suggestions from other pupils about where they think each plot should be positioned. At the end of this lesson, there's also an opportunity for pupils to anonymously ask questions or to make a comment about an aspect related to the relationship breakup or other RSE content. It's important that each pupil in the class is writing something down at the same time to ensure that any questions written are truly anonymous. If pupils don't want to ask a question, they could instead write down their favourite flavour of ice cream or tell you a joke. Writing anonymous questions can help to take away a pupil's potential anxiety about asking a question to your face, but that's not to say that they don't want a personal response. So it can be helpful to ask pupils to indicate whether they want a response to the whole class, which would maintain confidentiality about who wrote the question, whether they want a one-to-one response, which would require the pupil to include their name, or whether it's just a comment for your information. After the lesson, have a read through each of the responses and filter the key questions and statements from the other submissions. Plan your responses, making sure that they're age and stage appropriate, and ensure to make time in the following lesson to share the answers as needed. The Do Now activity for the third lesson of the unit involves pupils deciding where along a healthy relationship spectrum they would position each of these 9 actions. Because the full descriptions of each act are already shown on the worksheet, pupils can just write the relevant letters, although you might want to ask pupils to annotate some of their plotted letters to show their reasoning, as shown in my example here. Annotating their responses means that pupils are already prepared with contributions they can share with the rest of the class during a subsequent conversation. Similar to the activity in the previous lesson, there's not always a clear-cut position in which to place these statements. For example, although a couple could be so compatible that they never argue or disagree, perhaps this is actually reflective of one person being more dominant in the relationship and the other person simply complying to try to keep the peace. At the end of this lesson, pupils will come back to the worksheet and can make annotations using a pen of a different colour to show potential changes in their thinking. Pupils then go on to watch a video which is framed as a typical boy meets girl Hollywood romance, but actually starts to demonstrate problematic behaviours. This then leads into a discussion of what constitutes stalking, as exemplified by the 4 acronym shown here. Information on the slide deck outlines what the law says about stalking and lists examples of specific stalking behaviours. The lesson then explores the 5 main types of stalkers identified through research of more than 200 case studies, before revisiting the handout from the previous lesson, asking pupils to consider which, if any, of the behaviours could be viewed as stalking. I've identified some examples here which are most likely to be the ones to cause potential problems in the future, although there's also a chance that social media checking can become obsessive or that other issues may arise after the excessive use of drugs or alcohol. It would also be interesting to ask pupils to cross-reference the behaviours they link with stalking against their Axes worksheet from the previous lesson and to identify if there's any connection around where these originally plotted actions were placed. Pupils then read a scenario from the Alice Ruggles Trust about 2 people named Jaden and Soraya. Pupils then asked to identify 3 potential ways that Soraya could respond to the situation in the scenario using the consequence tree worksheet. To show you how this might work, I'm going to suggest 3 options of speaking to Jaden about what's happening, going no contact and blocking him as much as is possible, or reporting Jaden's behaviour to police. We're going to break down that first option in more detail. So Soraya explains to Jaden how she feels and how his actions have been affecting her. In one outcome, Jaden realises that Soraya isn't interested in him and then apologises for his actions. However, he may also refuse to believe that she doesn't have any feelings for him. At that point, perhaps her friends might intervene, so Jaden backs off, or he keeps pursuing her and she then needs to end up trying another option afterwards. The idea is to build up lots of consequences of each of the 3 potential actions, so you end up creating a tree of possibilities. It's important that each outcome is something which could potentially happen, but as shown here, they don't have to all be positive outcomes. We're trying to look at the could about what could happen here. Ultimately, this then becomes the basis of a discussion which evaluates each of the 3 actions. Based on all the possible outcomes, which one has the most positive outcome overall? What should Soraya do in this situation in order to give her the best possible outcome? You can then flip this slightly and ask pupils what would Soraya be most likely to do in the situation and why. It's all well and good that we know what we can do, we know what the potential outcomes are, but what is it that she's going to do and what are the reasons for that? And if it's not what we know is the best thing for her to do, why is it that she's not actively doing what is in her best interest? The point of this activity is to help pupils to be more aware of the potential consequences of their actions and the actions of others through a distanced scenario. In other units where this task is used, it's also a way of encouraging pupils to come to a decision themselves rather than being told by a teacher about what they should and shouldn't be doing. After this task, there's a video from the Alice Ruggles Trust to provide advice about what Soraya should be doing in this situation, and then another opportunity for pupils to ask an anonymous question. The 4th and final lesson in this unit starts by asking pupils to make a list of health services before pupils consider the reasons that a person might attend a sexual health clinic. The initial preconceptions will likely be about getting free condoms or having an STI test. Some pupils might make comments about getting information about abortion or other pregnancy options, which follows content from the Year 10 RSE unit. To increase pupils' awareness of the services offered by sexual health clinics, they'll then read through the 8 case studies on this handout and consider what other services might be available to explain why these people have all attended this imaginary sexual health clinic today. When pupils come up with their ideas, discuss them as a class, encouraging pupils to explain why they think their chosen answer is the most likely reason for each character's visit. There are answers on the slide deck, but they're only suggestions and guidance. It may well be that the characters are actually attending for something other than what has been mentioned in their case study. And it's important for clinical practitioners to not make assumptions about the reasons why people are attending. Further services offered by sexual health clinics are also shown later in the slide deck, although it's also really important to clarify to pupils that not all clinics offer the same services. Next up is a short task in which pupils stand up if they think a statement being read out is true and sit down if they think it's false. You could also adapt this to make it a continuum task where pupils instead move to opposite sides of the classroom based on their answers. The answers and explanations are included in the Scheme of Learning document, with the final statement setting up conversations about the Gillick competencies and the Fraser guidelines. The slide deck explains the difference between these two sets of guidelines, as does the Scheme of Learning, but in a nutshell, health practitioners are legally permitted to provide medical treatment to a child under the age of 16 without advising the child's parents, on the condition that the child demonstrates a full understanding of what they're agreeing to and the potential consequences of the treatment. The Gillick competencies relate to general health treatments, whereas the Fraser guidelines specifically deal with sexual health advice, such as accessing contraception. There's a fact sheet from the NSPCC included with the lesson resources to provide further information about both guidelines, and a link to the Care Quality Commission website from the notes in the slide deck. It's important that pupils are aware of where the nearest sexual health clinics are, even if they have no intention of using them, just as it would be prudent to highlight where the nearest hospital or dentist would be located. The NHS service locator website is linked from the slide notes. You can enter the school postcode and then show pupils where nearby sexual health clinics can be found. Ideally, you'd also show pupils the website for the local sexual health services and highlight key features such as how to book an appointment, how STI tests and condoms can be ordered, and other relevant information. A first-person perspective video about a visit to a sexual health clinic is also included in the slide deck to reduce potential anxiety about what it might be like to visit. And there's also a World of Work spotlight on the role of a sexual health advisor, which aims to make pupils feel more comfortable and less embarrassed about such a visit. The final main activity in the lesson involves watching a video about how people can complete an STI test at home, and then having pupils sequence the steps listed on this handout to check their understanding. It can be really helpful to have a physical STI kit to use as a prop for the lesson. Ideally, try to order one from your local sexual health clinic a few weeks before the lesson. They usually come in a very plain bag with no logos or branding. It's quite discreet, and that in itself is quite helpful to tell pupils to stop them from being worried about everyone knowing what's going to be in a parcel if they were to order an STI kit or condoms in the future. Most of the lessons in this unit include additional resources which you can use to increase your subject knowledge or to refer to as needed, but if you're looking for further information to support your delivery of these lessons, you may find these organisations helpful. The Alice Ruggles Trust is a charity that raises awareness about coercive control and stalking. The lesson on stalking used some of the resources from their website, and there's also other resources available which cover healthy relationships, personal safety, and the warning signs of controlling behaviour. Brooke is a sexual health and wellbeing charity for young people. Their website offers a range of resources such as on-demand training, some of which is free, as well as lesson plans, posters, and fact sheets. The PSHE Association is the subject association for PSHE. They provide guidance, training, and lesson resources to align with statutory RSE requirements. Members of the PSHE Association can access additional resources from Medway Public Health, which have been featured in various RSE units across the OAT curriculum. And finally, SURE is an organisation dedicated to tackling online harms, including image-based abuse and digital consent. Their website is focused on helping students to navigate relationships in a digital world and understanding their rights regarding online safety and privacy. It could be quite helpful as a resource for you to look at in order to better understand how to frame answers or how to give advice during lessons.